Thanks for this opportunity to really share a few insights about men, and I have no conflicts of interest to declare. So why are we talking about men? As most of us already know that in Africa, HIV prevalence and incidence is more severe in women compared to men. But despite that, we know that globally about half of the people living with HIV are actually men. And we do know that men are consistently actually less likely to use HIV prevention services, in particular knowledge of the HIV status. And also men actually contribute to the onward transmission of HIV to others. And also that men, unlike women, are actually more likely to die of AIDS-related illnesses. And if you look at this phylogenetic analysis that was done in South Africa, which Linda talked about a bit earlier, when you look at the cycle of transmission of HIV, men are actually critical within that cycle. So what that means to us is that as implementers and as programmers, it is critical to target women, but targeting women alone will not actually break this cycle. So men are essential in breaking this cycle of transmission, and hence the necessity of actually targeting our interventions towards men. So luckily enough, through a lot of research that has been done in this field, we have a plethora of HIV prevention tools for men that are actually at our disposal. But we are struggling to actually get men to use these services. If you look at, for example, HIV testing, we are seeing there is actually low coverage of HIV testing among men, and this is DHS reports that were derived from a multiplicity of African countries. Save for a few exceptions, in many countries, we are seeing that disparity between men and women. Also, if we look at the recently released FEAR data, we are seeing that in terms of the progress towards 90-90-90, essentially also there are huge disparities, particularly with the first 90, where we are seeing a 10% difference in access to testing between men and women. Luckily enough, we are seeing that we are catching up as far as the second and third 90 is concerned. But given that the first 90 is actually the critical entry point, then really a lot more needs to be done at that particular stage. If we dig deeper to another HIV prevention intervention, particularly voluntary medical male circumcision, and we are seeing that this is, for example, data from Zambia, where about 68% of men who indicated that they were aware about VMMC and expressed interest, but only 11% actually ended up being circumcised. So why do we have this huge disparity between interest and actually actual utilization of the service? So there's a lot of literature that exists out there that tells us why men are not using HIV prevention services. We know issues such as social stigma are actually discouraging men. We know for interventions like VMMC, there's a fear of pain and related adverse events. Then men tend to actually deny that they're at risk and actually externalize that risk. But also most important is that the setup of most of our health systems is a bit unfriendly to men, and actually seeking services is actually a big hassle. But also to note the lack of provider empathy and the fact that many men living in an androcentric and patriarchal setup have constructed masculinity to imply that a man who is strong enough should actually not fall sick. So being HIV positive essentially challenges these social constructions of masculinity. And I want to draw attention to this. This is recent data coming from the Breaking the Cycle of Transmission study and project that is actually happening in South Africa. And it draws our attention to the fact that for many men, particularly when it comes to accessing HIV testing services, then the cost-benefit analysis, we see that actually the costs far outweigh the benefits. And men are struggling with many issues which range from grief and trauma. Some of them are actually born orphans, but they've also lost close friends and family to the epidemic. We are seeing that for many of them, testing HIV positive means their life is actually shattered, as well as disclosure is actually a frightening encounter for many men. So because of all these factors, men actually tend to put on a facade of indifference. But the reality is that actually men deep down are actually scared. And they're scared because if you look at their HIV testing and linkage journey, actually is actually characterized by a lot of fear and also loss. So the implication for us then is how do we turn this around? So I want to throw some reflections here, and I look at this publication that was done by Sam and colleagues based on work in voluntary medical male circumcision. And the critical takeaway from this reflection is that really, as a global public health community, we have done a lot of work as far as availing HIV prevention services is concerned. But the gap is how do we motivate men to actually utilize these HIV prevention services? So it needs a behavioral dimension to address the current challenges. And I also want to reference Dr. Nduku Kilonzo, who is the director of the Kenya National AIDS Control Council, who also notes that HIV acquisition is actually a behavioral issue, and essentially also uptake of interventions also requires a behavioral dimension to address that. So essentially then we need to turn the tide. And how do we turn the tide? For me, there are three critical questions we need to reflect about. The first one is really how might we make HIV prevention services to be convenient and also attractive to men? Then how do we also make men to actually crave for these services which they need, but as I've highlighted previously, they actually fear? And finally is how might we make actually the benefits of seeking HIV prevention services to actually outweigh the costs. So we need to put forward a value proposition for men to seek HIV prevention services. So to do this, I just want to share with you a framework that we have developed in Jhpiego around how we approach delivering services to men. It's a three-part framework. The first part is really around delving deeper into understanding clients. The second part is around delivering blended program activities. And finally, you actually achieve impact. And the remainder of my presentation will actually focus around that framework. So the first part is really how do we go about understanding our clients? And I want to reference this recent work also done by Sema and colleagues at the Sugo Foundation, where they look at the cubes, which essentially means to change behavior, you need to understand the barriers and enable us to these different stages of change. So what this framework simply communicates is that for one to change behavior, you go through different stages that will start from knowledge, go to intention, action, then for some interventions like ART, like oral prep, you need to use it persistently. So there's a question of repeat and the question of forming a habit around utilization of some of these interventions. But within that, there is a lot of enablers and barriers at two levels. On the one hand, we have perceptual, which touch with issues around beliefs, around emotions, around biases and personality. And on the other hand, you have contextual barriers, issues around infrastructure, around policies and laws, all that. So these barriers and enablers are actually relayed, particularly to men, through the channels they encounter and people within their circles of influence. And this could include their family and friends, it could include their community, or even the media and the society at large. And all this work together to actually influence what action a man is likely to take at the end of the day. So how do we deeply understand client perspectives? And I think one of the key challenges for HIV prevention is that we have very good interventions. Take, for example, oral prep, with more than 90% efficacy. But what happens is we take a good intervention and we layer it within an existing health system that is already unfriendly to men. And because men are not essentially motivated to utilize HIV prevention services, then we see challenges around uptake. So it means then we need a different dimension on how we approach some of these interventions. And probably this calls for us to go beyond public health and look at other fields. And marketing, for example, is one of the fields. Marketers approach things a bit differently. They start first by looking at what clients want and what are the desires of clients, and they develop interventions to actually respond to those needs and desires. So three approaches that I want to suggest which could help us move towards that direction. One is a human-centered design. And human-centered design essentially is an approach that helps us uncover deep insights about men in particularly. And through that, we're actually able to unlock new avenues for action. Market segmentation helps us to look at men based on their different dynamics, and I'll be talking more about this. And finally, behavior economics is essentially a framework that helps us to understand how people make decisions and how they actually behave in relation to HIV prevention. So essentially, behavior economics, as I've said, is a data-driven approach that helps us understand the psychology behind human behaviors and how they make decisions. And the underlying premise is essentially that when people make choices, most of these choices often seem non-rational. And there is a possibility in being able to predict these patterns of non-rational choice, and through that we are able to design interventions that actually match that perspective. Market segmentation, there are multiple avenues or ways of doing segmentation, but I want to narrow down to these three, largely demographic, psychographic, and behavioral segmentation. But most important is that if you're able to segment men and users of HIV prevention interventions through a combination of the three, which is more holistic, then you are able to actually target and tailor interventions to address the real need. And I just want to share with you some practical examples. This is a project I lead in Kenya where we are delivering oral PrEP to men who have sex with men. And this is an example of market segmentation that we actually did for MSM, where you're seeing there are actually 4 MSM archetypes. And the way we design interventions and demand creation is totally different to each of these unique segments based on their dynamics. For example, if you look at TAS, this is somebody who is actually secretively gay. So it means the kind of interventions you need to use to reach to them is those that guarantee them confidentiality of their sexual orientation. This is also an example of psychographic segmentation that was done for VMMC from Zambia. And you can see 7 client archetypes were developed, and each of these archetypes is actually targeted differently based on their unique characteristics. So I also talked about human-centered design, which is predominantly a qualitative process, and it actually offers us both the tools and techniques that helps us as programmers to be able to approach clients with empathy, connect, and actually in a respectful way, which is what men want. It also helps us to deeply understand the human emotional needs and connect at the emotional level with clients. And through that, we're able to develop actually action-oriented solutions. So this is the human-centered design process. It often begins by framing a problem. I threw an example like from the field of oral PrEP, like how might we get actually men to take PrEP every day for a long time. Then you go through a process of discovery, exploration, analysis to actually understand what are the real insights or the real issues that we need to address. Then through that, you're able to frame and ask a design question. For example, how might we support clients to unlock their PrEP motivation? Then through that, you develop prototypes which you test, you refine, you pilot and refine again iteratively, and finally you actually get a solution on how to address that. And this process involves a lot of connecting with clients, respectful relationships, as well as deep understanding. So essentially through the design process, what is the most important thing that it yields is actually insights, which are actually windows of opportunity to help us understand the clients in further depth. And through the same project, I just wanted to share a few insights around that came from the work with men who have sex with men. If you look at, for example, the first insight, I never see pictures of people like me. These were actually clients talking about the fact that most of the messaging out there is patronizing as well as stigmatizing. In the second insight, they talk about the fact that they don't trust any communication or anything that comes out of the MSM community. And the third one talks about the strong peer influence that exists within this community. So those insights are actually opportunities for us to design both demand creation as well as to also tailor services that respond to the insights of what the clients are telling us. So I also wanted to share just some insights from a recent design sprint we did also with MSM. We wanted to understand why do we have low continuation? And we put both providers, programmers, and clients in the same room. And what we see from this exercise is essentially the approach from providers, their perspectives, is that actually clients are rational, they know they're engaging at risk, so that should actually translate to utilization of PrEP. The counseling was very prescriptive around the do's and don'ts. On the other side, from the clients, the perspective we got is that actually they make a lot of emotional decisions. Their PrEP journey is more laden with social perceptions. What do people think about me? Am I going to be stigmatized? issues around love, relationships, and really living for now. And clients actually crave for choice. So they want to be offered a choice of how, when, and where they actually get their PrEP. So you see, these are actually conflicting narratives that emerge through this process. But it's important, even as human-centered design, behavior economics, and market segmentation gives us all these insights, I think it's important for us to get a reality check. And this is an example of some of the outcomes of a human-centered design process in developing messaging for PrEP actually among MSM. And you're seeing that MSM actually wanted very bold messaging. But on the other hand, stakeholders actually want very subtle messaging. So that is part of the reality we confront. There are times you may develop very good interventions, but the social context does not allow. So that may call for at times watering down some of the best interventions to respond to that. So finally, I just want to draw on case studies around a number of projects across the African continent that have actually delivered blended program activities to achieve impact. This is through insight-driven mobilization as well as tailored service delivery. And I just begin by the Jhpiego project that I talked about. Most of those insights led to the development of this Let's Get Real communication campaign. And PrEP services are actually delivered through drop-in centers, which are standalone clinics that purely serve men who have sex with men. And through that approach, what we have seen is that so far about 4,000 and above MSM have actually been enrolled on PrEP. That's almost 50% of the estimated population within the country. And this project is already 122% over the target, more than a year before the end of the project. Also from Zambia, I want to draw on an experience in voluntary medical male circumcision. This is work done by PSI and Society for Family Health, where they actually developed a communication strategy for VMMC that was responding to insights that were actually derived from talking to some of the potential VMMC clients. And by implementing this strategy, we are seeing that 91% of the clients who are circumcised were actually the right age group that is likely to translate to impact for VMMC. That is between 15 and 29 years. Same to the AIDS-free project in Malawi, which was struggling in mobilization and uptake of VMMC among the right priority age group. And insights pointed at the need to actually revamp their demand creation strategy. And some of those are just some of the activities that they did to that end. And as you can see from this graph, what you see the median before of the percentage of clients who are actually between 15 and 29 years was actually about 42%. But after instituting these interventions, we are seeing the median has gone to about 64%. So essentially it tells us that if you approach mobilization using an insight-driven approach, then it actually translates to impact. In Lesotho, we have the Hot Laments Clinic, and Lesotho was actually struggling with getting men to actually come for HIV prevention services. HIV testing was being done using VMMC as the entry point, and the strategy that was implemented by the SEPO project in Lesotho was actually to establish a men's-only clinic within a public hospital. And this particular clinic offers comprehensive services, which are integrated using a one-stop shop model, and the providers are purely male because of the stronger patriarchal setting within that context. And what happened is that since this clinic was established, the number of male clients coming in has actually more than doubled, and we are seeing also an increase in the positive yield, which moved from about 3% when HIV testing was offered through VMMC as an entry point to actually 14%. Then in Tanzania, I want to reference the Sauti project, and the approach that the Sauti project has actually used is to actually characterize the different male typologies. What they do is they have been able to map the clients of adolescent girls and young women, the clients of female sex workers, MSM, and other men within the general population. And the figure that you see there is an example of the different clients of adolescent girls and young women. So through this mapping exercise, they've been able to identify the hotspots where these men are actually found. and some of the workplaces. They also do a lot of consultation with the sexual partners, as I did allude, and also engaging community leaders on what approaches could work. And the most important is actually to provide male-friendly services out of that. And what we are seeing through this exercise is, for example, the Sauti project, about 50% of the people that have actually received HIV testing services were actually new testers. And based on this data, you're able to identify which areas are actually yielding high HIV positivity. Then I also want to reference the Afya Plus Kamili project in Kenya, which was actually delivering HIV testing in routine settings, which included client-initiated and provider-initiated services. And what you can see from 2011 to 2016, when the routine HIV testing was offered, about 3 million men were actually tested. And the positivity was averagely about 2.5%. From around 2016, they implemented index client testing. And what we are seeing is an exponential difference, where you're seeing, like for 2019 up to date, their testing positivity yield is actually about 26%. And they've actually tested less than 5% of the proportion of men that they actually used to test before. So this also drives towards efficiencies. Then also just talking of HIV Self Testing as another strategy for reaching men. And this was launched as a national strategy in Kenya. And we have about 17 pharmacies that are actually selling HIV self-testing kits. And the idea behind implementing this strategy is actually to reach out to men who rarely access HIV testing services. And looking at the demographic, most of them are above 25 years, and most of them are actually of a middle income status. So far about 34,000 test kits have been sold, and you're seeing the median age is 29 years, and actually 60% of the clients who are actually buying the self-test kits are actually men. So in conclusion, reaching women with HIV prevention and treatment services is actually essential, but we realize it's not enough to stop the epidemic. And we really need to reach out to men if we want to reduce incidents among women, but also among men and protect girls. Then, as I have alluded, you've seen that men face numerous social challenges that discourage them from seeking HIV prevention and treatment services, and it's actually important for us to unlock the barriers and generate a deep understanding of these challenges. Some of the innovative tools that I've highlighted, like behavior economics, human-centered design, and market segmentation, offers promise and approaches that we can use towards this end. And finally, I know within Jhpiego we have applied these tools based on some of the programs that I shared, and we are seeing that they offer a solution and an approach that can be used to actually address challenges in VMMC, reaching the right age group, challenges in HIV testing, reaching out to men, as particularly new testers, and also in terms of ART retention and PrEP continuation. So finally, I just want to acknowledge some of the individuals who have contributed towards making this presentation, donor agencies and organizations whose work I highlighted here. Thank you.